Привit, moi druzy. Hello, my friends. It is day 357 in this horrible war in Ukraine. Today, I'm going to cover a number of different subjects, but the one will bleed into another. So we're going to go from a battlefield update to how Moscow is aware of the need to ramp up production, to how Ukraine's partners in Ramstein are also aware of that and what they're doing. We'll talk about why jets matter. We'll talk about General Petraeus' assessment of the war. There's this wonderful interview where he just lays out his perspective, and it is awesome. We'll talk about why concluding the war matters, and then we'll talk about news from 1 year ago today. So we're going to start with this article from the Guardian yesterday that Ukrainians blow up a bridge near Bakhmut, and the idea here is that they are under heavy fire. They're trying to defend Bakhmut. Should they continue to defend Bakhmut? Well, that's an open question. Ukrainian forces have reportedly blown up a bridge near the eastern city of Bakhmut in a sign that they may be planning to retreat from the area, which would give Russia a significant symbolic boost ahead of the first anniversary of the war. It appears that the Kremlin is concentrating maximum force on capturing Bakhmut before the 1 year anniversary. But the Ukrainians have also reinforced Bakhmut, and so they're just kind of drawn into this fight. And it's funny because there's like 4 or 5 different places along the front lines that it's not really strategic places. Well, some of them are, but they're not in general like some big master plan strategic push. They're just kind of where people have settled on either side, and then they keep reinforcing each other. It's really a bizarre thing to watch. Okay, Russia declares battlefield gains as Ukraine urges faster military aid. And here we see during the offensive, Ukrainian troops randomly retreated to distances up to 1.9 miles from the previously occupied line. So they have gotten pushed back some. Even more fortified second line of defense, the enemy could not hold the breakthrough of the Russian military. So the Russians seem fairly determined to get something before this deadline. This was in the Luhansk region. Zelensky's office said the situation in the region remains difficult. And a little bit further down, Zelensky said on Tuesday, Russia is in a hurry to achieve as much as it can with its latest push before Ukraine and its allies gather strength. This was my thesis about a week ago when I said, like, if I was Russia, here's what I would do. I would just make some gain somewhere just so that I could get some traction before heavy armor got to the battlefield. This is why speed is of the essence, he said, as NATO defense chiefs met in Brussels for talks to continue on Wednesday. Speed in everything, adopting decisions, carrying out decisions, shipping supplies, training. Speed saves lives, he said. And here's another of Zelensky's speeches. We must understand the significance of these battles. Every meter won there is a defense of our entire country. Every day that our heroes endure in Bakhmut, Voldahar, Marinka, and other cities and communities in Donbass means the reduction of Russian aggression for weeks. So, like, whatever you can hold, it's all meaningful. You know, he started that speech interestingly. Today is another day of Ramstein, a meeting of the group of military support for Ukraine, 54 partner countries. I didn't realize it expanded all the way to 54. Our partners had confirmed more air defense systems, more tanks, more artillery and shells, more training for our military. What we didn't hear about is jets, and there's a reason why we didn't hear about jets. But we'll come to that in just a little bit. Now, this is yesterday's ISW. Western reporting indicates that there continue to be Western concerns about Ukraine's determination to hold Bakhmut. Okay, so that's interesting. U.S. defense planners assess that Ukrainian forces are unable to simultaneously defend Bakhmut and launch a spring counteroffensive, and they have urged Ukraine to prioritize the spring counteroffensive over defending Bakhmut. Now, abandoning Bakhmut would be a symbolic victory for Russia, a symbolic defeat for Ukraine. But if that's what's necessary to do in order to have their counteroffensive that does something even better, you might want to let go of one in order to get the other. But let me continue. The ISW continues to assess that Ukraine's decision to defend Bakhmut is likely strategically sound because it's costing Russia a lot. I mean, the attrition rate for the Russians is very high. Ukraine's defense of Bakhmut has also forced the Kremlin to expend much of the Wagner Group as a force and commit high-value Russian airborne forces to sustain the advances. Ukraine's defense of Bakhmut and undertaking an effort to conditions for counteroffensive are likely complementary, not mutually exclusive, says the ISW. So it's not necessarily a bad idea to be defending Bakhmut. Russia claims advance in Luhansk. Ukraine says the situation is difficult. We just talked about this kind of thing as well, where Ukraine's military says its troops are repelling some attacks, but the situation is difficult. Ukraine's general staff said on February 15th the focus of fighting was around not only Bakhmut, but Lyman, Advinka, and Kupiansk. And again, it's bizarre to my mind that it's all these places that I don't think either side necessarily would have picked. Maybe somewhat up north they would have picked this, but around Bakhmut, it doesn't make any sense. Let's look at what the British Ministry of Defense said on February 9th. Deputy Secretary Council Chairman Dmitry Medvedev called for an increase in Russian tank production. So the Russians are aware that they need to ramp up their military production. This was followed by several public comments by President Putin urging the defense industry to better support the special military operation. Like, what are you doing? Why aren't you doing what you're supposed to be doing? January 12th, Putin castigated Denis Manturov, the deputy prime minister, with his responsibility for the defense industry for fooling around. Okay, so that's sending a signal you better be doing something. Production is almost certainly falling short of the Russian Ministry of Defense's demands to resource the Ukraine campaign and restore its longer-term defense requirements. So they know that they're running short on munitions and armor and other weapons, and so they're getting it. They're aware of it. But so is NATO. NATO urged to boost ammunition production as war enters a critical stage. So while at times Russia has reportedly been firing a staggering 20,000 artillery shells a day, that's a lot. According to some estimates, Ukraine is firing between 6,000 and 7,000 a day. So they know that they have to boost production, and that's what they're talking about at Ramstein. Now, there is this fascinating article in Time, why NATO is giving Ukraine air defense systems, not fighter jets. And they never actually answered the question, but they said a lot of really interesting things along the way. So, for example, while Ukraine seeks air power, NATO's focus is on the ground. The Allies are pouring in artillery, armor, air defense systems to help Ukrainian forces fend off a major new Russian attack in the eastern part of the country, aimed at breaking the current stalemate. If Kyiv can blunt Russian forces, push this spring, then it would be primed to launch a counteroffensive in the summer to reclaim territory previously lost. Okay, so understanding where they're coming from and why they're trying to do what they're doing is really important. Now, what's Russia doing? Russia is pre-positioning troops and aircraft along Ukraine's eastern border in what Western officials believe are preparations for a broad offensive targeting Kharkiv region in the northeast and Zaporizhzhia in the southeast. Now, why do Ukrainians keep asking for jets? Well, the answer is found here. With Russia's land forces hobbled, along with signs that the air forces will become more active, Ukraine is seeking new fighter jets to fight back. Ukraine currently relies on its Soviet-era fighter jets, which were made before Kyiv declared independence from the Soviet Union over 30 years ago. The planes had been overpowered by Russia's modern jets that can fire missiles from a long range without entering Ukrainian airspace. That's interesting. They can hover back in Russia, shoot their missiles, and then go back to their base, and it will still have a damaging effect in Ukraine, but the Ukrainians can't really answer back with these particular jets. Now, one of the reasons that the Western allies don't want to give these jets is because if these jets that are firing from Russia are in Russia, then they're firing back on them in Russia, well, then that can be expanding the war, and they're trying to limit that kind of expansion. So that helps you get into the mind of what's going on with the planners who are trying to help Ukraine win without expanding it into World War III. Okay, let's turn to our main topic, and that is, what does David Petraeus think as he sees this? If we're looking through his eyes, how are we seeing what's going on in the war? Okay, so there's a little setup here. The war in Ukraine is at a stalemate, but that doesn't mean that it's not changing. General David Petraeus predicts what the war will look like this year with significant offensives. Now, David Petraeus is the real deal. He wrote the book on counterinsurgency, literally wrote the book on counterinsurgency. It's the U.S. Army's manual. He says that the Russians have lost many battles because of multiple failures of their military culture, doctrine, organizational structures, training, and equipping. Petraeus, who criticized the Biden administration's withdrawal in Afghanistan, strikes a different tone on Ukraine. He says that the president's team has done a very impressive job of leading NATO and the West to counter Russian invasion. That's what I say. I say the way that we left Afghanistan encouraged Putin and to move forward like, oh, see how weak the US is? But the way that the Biden administration has handled this so far, I've got to give him credit. He's had a very tough time trying to thread that needle of supporting Ukraine and not potentially losing allies or kicking off World War III. So he's doing the best that he can with the current situation. While the Russians may be preparing to send hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Ukraine in a new offensive, they will face off in the coming months with better trained, better organized Ukrainian soldiers armed with American long-range missiles, armored vehicles, and a tremendous amount of ammunition. So the interviewer says, who's winning this war? Petraeus says it's not Russia. Russia has, after all, lost the battles of Kyiv, Sumy, Cherniv, Kharkiv, failed to take the rest of Ukraine's southern coast. And that's a good point. I mean, the Russians have been beaten back from whatever their objectives were. Although Russian forces have made grinding, incremental, and very costly gains in the villages around Bakhmut, and they're still making those grinding gains. That's true. Uh, they've taken that. I mean, I've got to give them credit for that, even though it's been a Pyrrhic victory. The side that generates the most capable, well-trained, and well-equipped forces by then will make the most significant gains, and my bet is on Ukraine in that regard, he says. Okay, he goes on and says, we are, however, seeing some glimpses and hints of what the future of warfare may look like. So Petraeus is giving his predictions of what he's seeing. He's not saying that Ukraine is the future, but he's saying some of the things that we're seeing in Ukraine are actually going to be in the future. We see the Ukrainian use of drones. Yeah, drones are absolutely changing the battlefield. Perhaps most notably, of course, we are seeing a war taking place for the first time in a context that includes the widespread presence of smartphones, internet connectivity, and social media and other internet sites. Like, it's kind of hard to imagine, like, so Vietnam was the first war that was really like piped into people's homes through television because you could do that. World War II, you'd go to the movies and there'd be a little preview news thing about what was going on in there. Right now, you're seeing things in real time. I do daily updates on YouTube. So the interviewer asked, several years back, some people were calling NATO obsolete. Is it? Petraeus answers, this question gets at one of the ironies of the situation. Putin set out to make Russia great again. However, what he has done is make NATO great again, with two very capable, historically neutral powers, Finland and Sweden, seeking NATO membership. And if you put Sweden and Finland together, it's about the size of the real estate of Ukraine, and that's pretty significant, just the opposite of what Putin was actually trying to accomplish. So he's asked, is the Russian military performance in Ukraine surprising to you? Petraeus answers, not completely. In an interview with The Atlantic, published shortly before the Russian invasion, I explained the considerable difficulties I expected Russia would encounter and noted that an invasion force of some 190,000 was much less than what would likely be required, especially if the Ukrainians proved to be as determined as I thought that they would be, and they have been even more so. Beyond that, I didn't foresee how miserably the Russians would perform. Like, they have performed very poorly. I've said it a few times. They pants themselves on the world stage. Like, we all thought they're big and bad, and they're like, really? That's how they did? Okay, the question is Russia failing because of failures of intelligence or failures of conscripts or failures of Russian military culture? And Petraeus says all of the above and more. The list is long, including poor campaign design, wholly inadequate training. What were they doing for all these months that they were deployed on the northern, eastern, and southern borders of Ukraine? Poor command, control, and communications, inadequate discipline, poor equipment, insufficient logistical capability, inability to achieve combined arms effect, lack of professional non-commissioned officer corps, pervasive corruption. I mean, the list goes on and on. All kinds of things are plaguing Russia. So Bergen asks, do we not have to worry about Russia as a great power anymore? Nope. Slow punch the brakes. Russia still has enormous military capability and is certainly a nuclear superpower, as well as a country with enormous energy, mineral, and agricultural blessings. And it's still led by a kleptocrat dictator who embraces innumerable grievances. So he's not going away, and it's not like he's going to change his tune like, oh, you know what? We lost a lot of soldiers. I guess we'll go home. That's not the way that Putin's thinking, at least not yet. He has to be ground down to come to terms with this. Bergen asks, the observations sometimes attributed to Stalin Quantity has a quality all its own. Will that make a critical difference? Petraeus says, well, if Putin mobilized all of Russia successfully, sure. However, to date, the mobilizations have been partial as Putin seems to fear how the country might respond to total mobilization. That's right. Putin's making a political calculation. I need only so many. I'm really not going to tick off the public and potentially hurt my base. Now, I talked about how the Russians are not uprising, but pushed enough, they could go from isolates to activists, and he does not want to see that happen. Okay. As many as 300,000 new recruits and mobilized reservists are being sent to the front lines, with up to 100,000 to 150,000 more on the way. Quantity does indeed matter. So Bergen asks, but is Napoleon correct in this case? In war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1, and Ukrainian morale seems to be higher. That's a huge factor, says Petraeus. Ukrainians see this ongoing conflict as their war of independence. It truly is their war of independence. Zelensky has been positively Churchillian. Zelensky, I can't say enough good things about him. Ukrainians know what they're fighting for, and while it's not clear that the same is true for many of the Russian soldiers. So that morale factor is huge. What technologies have proven to be successful in Ukraine? And he talked about Elon Musk's Starlink mobile satellite system, kept communications flowing for the Ukrainians. AI has been able to be used to enable the Ukrainians to identify Russian soldiers on the battlefield. The Turkish armored drones have been devastating. In fact, the Ukrainians have also been shown to be exceptional in MacGyvering things, to create creative solutions, adapting Western missiles for use on their MiG-29 fighters. I mean, just all kinds of things. Okay, how would you grade the Biden administration for their approach to the war? He says, I think the Biden administration has led the NATO and the rest of the Western world very impressively. Moving on, eventually, for example, Ukraine's going to have to transition from the Eastern Bloc aircraft MiG-29s to Western ones, F-16s. There just aren't any more MiGs to provide them, and they reportedly have more pilots than aircraft at this point, so we might as well begin the process of transition. So, the Biden administration is trying to thread that needle, trying to support Ukraine, trying not to kick off World War III, and trying to simultaneously not lose any allies that are a little bit more peacenik-like. So that's where we are. But we got to do it sooner or later. How would you grade Putin on this campaign? Has he got anything right? Putin has earned a failing grade to date. Stop. Now, I talked about this yesterday, and I've said the same thing for a long time. I study leadership. This is my field of expertise. And I said, Putin has just been a terrible leader. And then I had a comment yesterday that was saying, like, how can you say this? Like, there's an obvious question here. And it's a legitimate question. The obvious second thought here is, if Putin is that bad at leadership, how comes he became president first and kind of won a couple of wars before? Okay, there's a difference between bad leader and bad leader. What I mean by that, he's a bad leader leading people the wrong direction for bad ends. That's one kind of bad, and he clearly is. And then there's bad leader, like, you're going to make errors, but he's going to make errors. And what I'm saying is, like, dictators, it would be terrible to be a dictator, because a dictator is always being told, yes, boss, you're so smart, you're so right, because people are kissing the boss's butt, like trying to not get thrown off a hotel balcony or whatever else. And so eventually he's going to make bad mistakes, and the more power that you have and the more wrong you are when you have more power, like in a democracy, you get checked. Republicans are good for Democrats, and Democrats are actually good for Republicans because they check each other and keep them from making really, really bad, stupid, or corrupt choices. So a dictator doesn't have that. So now Putin is making bad decisions, like invading Ukraine in the first place. Remember that? Go back and go on YouTube and go find that video where Putin is browbeating his cabinet and saying, like, so what's your answer? You think we should invade, right? Right? And then when somebody's kind of tentatively speaking up, he browbeats them. Like, you don't get that in a Western society nearly to the same degree. So what I had replied was, it doesn't tend to end well for dictators, because they begin to believe that they are awesome because everyone is constantly telling them so. So the guardrails come down and they make bad decisions that affect everyone because they have so much power and no one can tell them no. If you remember Saddam Hussein, after he was captured, he was in court and the judge is like condemning him and he's like, Who are you to talk to me like that? Like, that's still his mentality because he was so used to being the dictator who could just say anything and everybody else's life was held in his hands. And so there is a real problem when people are in power too long, or they have too much power, or they're not checked. And that's for multiple reasons. He was a bad leader. But here's Petraeus's view of this. Putin has earned a failing grade to date. Let's recall that the first and most important task of a strategic leader is to get the big ideas right. That is, to get the overall strategy and fundamental decisions right. Putin has clearly failed abysmally in this task because nobody could tell him otherwise. Like, if he wants to do this, he's like, okay, yeah, sure, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Right? Resulting in a war that has made him and his country a pariah, set back the Russian economy by a decade or more, losing many of Russia's best and brightest, prompting over 1,200 Western companies to leave Russia or reduce operations there, then catastrophic damage to the Russian military and its reputation, and put his legacy in serious jeopardy. That said, we should not underestimate Putin because he still believes that Russia can outsuffer the Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans. So he's been a terrible leader, but his strategy is to, we can suffer longer than you can, and that's a very bad place to be. Okay, let's scroll down a good deal because there's just a couple more things I want to discuss. How will the next stage of the war be different from the first year? And Petraeus answers, there will be several new features this year, most significantly the additional capabilities on the Ukrainian side. Western tanks and infantry vehicles, longer range and larger precision munitions. The U.S. provided HIMARS, high mobility rocket systems that will enable precise strikes out to 150 kilometers, twice the range of current munitions, and the air defense systems of various types, augmented air defense, and additional wheeled armor vehicles. So Ukraine's going to be packed with extra weapons. As time goes on, they get more of it. As time goes on, Russia has less of it. So we'll see how that all plays out. In 2003, at the beginning of the Iraq War, you famously asked a rhetorical question. Tell me how this ends. For the war in Ukraine, how does this end? And Petraeus says this: I think it ends in negotiated resolution when Putin recognizes that the war is unsustainable on both the battlefield, where Russia has first year likely taken as many times as the losses that the USSR took in nearly a decade in Afghanistan, and on the home front, which has been heavily impacted by financial, economic, and personal sanctions and export controls. So Petraeus is predicting that Putin will come to a negotiated peace when he's just exhausted. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but that sounds reasonable to me. I think Russia has to really lose on the battlefield significantly before Putin will be ready to admit that, but we'll see how that all works out. Okay, now why is this important? This is why it's important. Russia placed thousands of Ukrainian children in camps for re-education, a report says. This came out today. U.S. researchers say that Russia has relocated thousands of Ukrainian children to a network of sites in Russia-occupied territories of Ukraine and in Russia, whose main goal is to re-educate these children and make them pro-Russian. At least 6,000 Ukrainian children are held in these 43 camps. Now, most of these children are orphans and others that were in state facilities that were moved into the custody of these camps. The youngest child identified was just 4 months old, and they gave military training to children as young as 14. That's what they're doing. They're turning these Ukrainians against Ukraine, brainwashing these children. You need to end the war so that you can get these children back, let alone the children that had been kidnapped, taken to Ukraine, provided as adoptees for Russian families to do the same thing. This is really a genocidal type of action. Now let's look at what was going on 1 year ago today. Ukraine hit by a cyber attack as the U.S. questions Russia troop pullback. So Kyiv appears to blame Russia for a cyber attack on Tuesday as President Joe Biden warned that more than 150,000 Russian troops were still amassed near Ukraine's border after Moscow announced a partial pullback. It was met with skepticism. Well, yeah, there's a reason for the skepticism. On Tuesday, Russian defense minister published footage to demonstrate that it was returning some troops to a base after exercises. The Biden administration said that the United States had not verified the move. Our analysts indicate that they remain very much in a threatening position. Like, come on, like, that we have greater capabilities than that, and we can see it, right? Now let's look at just a minute or so of a video of Biden talking about what happened 1 year ago today. He was talking to the American people, he was talking to the Russian people. Let's hear him and see how he was framing what's going on.
The United States and NATO are not a threat to Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia. Neither the U.S. nor NATO have missiles in Ukraine. We do not have plans to put them there as well.
Okay, so
we're not targeting the people of Russia.
He's trying to take away all of Putin's objectives, but Putin, I think, has already mentally crossed the bridge by this point. He was just waiting for the Olympics to wind down so that he could do it.
We do not seek to destabilize Russia. To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. And I do not believe you want a bloody, destructive war against Ukraine, a country and a people with whom you share such deep ties of family, history, and culture.
But see, this doesn't matter because the people of Russia really have no say in this. It's really what Putin and his allies are willing to do, or what his allies are not willing to oppose him about, because there's really no check. Remember that the dictator, it really doesn't end well for dictators.
77 years ago, our people fought and sacrificed side by side to end the worst war in history. World War II was a war of necessity. But if Russia attacks Ukraine, it would be a war of choice.
And that's an excellent point, and Biden's making the point well. It's too little too late at this point.
A war without cause or reason. I say these things not to provoke, but to speak the truth, because the truth matters. Accountability matters. If Russia does invade in the days and weeks ahead, the human cost for Ukraine will be immense. And the strategic cost for Russia will also be immense.
And he's honestly, he's lived up to that. Between the sanctions and the military supplies being provided to Ukraine and everything else, the credibility of the United States, he has to go and do these things, and he has gone and done these things.
To attack Ukraine, it will be met with overwhelming international condemnation. The world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction. Invading Ukraine will prove to be a self-inflicted wound.
And so I got to give Biden props. I mean, that was a very good speech, and he's telling them don't do it, but I think it's already a little bit too little too late at that point. So if anything that we talked about today was helpful to you, would you please give a like, a thumbs up, ask a question, share this, subscribe, ring the bell. I'll be back tomorrow. I hope you will be. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.